to wait a few minutes, Brianna.
Ricardo, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, do we know how many people are signed up? No. Some people actually? Okay. Let me start. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on understanding and optimizing your supply chain. My name is Ricardo Newark, and I'm a consultant with the Florida SBDC at FIU. We'll start with some introductory slides about SBDC and a little bit about myself, and then we'll launch into trying to understand what the integrated supply chain is and how can we use that knowledge to optimize it. The Florida SBDC network is funded in part through an agreement with the Small Business Administration. And the organization, the SBDC as such is throughout the country. The Florida SBDC, as you can see here, is all through the state of Florida. We're hosted by different universities. Ours covers Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. You see that at the bottom of the slide. What we do is one-on-one business consulting. We can do startup assistance, access to capital, international trade, marketing, growth, government contracting. We have a large group of consultants specialized on different subjects that are ready to help clients with whatever area they need help on. We do also information, data, market research, and training workshops, such as this one. This is a group of the advisory team in Miami-Dade. And as you see, we have a large group of consultants here. And this is, sorry. And this is the group in Monroe County, smaller team. This is briefly my bio. I do consulting in several areas and have experience, diverse geographic experience, diverse corporate experience, and trying to adapt my consulting to the specific needs of the client. So let's start with the definition. What's the supply chain? And it's the widest definition would be it's a network that covers the movement and warehousing of goods from raw material to finished products and delivery to consumers. As you can see, this varies depending on the characteristics of the business and the product. But conceptually, since the raw material starts being sent somewhere until the final product arrives to the destination where the end user will buy it. This includes the design, planning, execution, control, and monitoring of all the activities involved. And the supply chain management goal is to create value by turning it into a competitive advantage, seamlessly integrating its components, synchronizing supply and demand, and measuring results. As we've seen lately, the supply chain might be a big drag in businesses, a big concern. But the message I want to deliver is that properly managed, understanding that the might be adverse circumstances can become a very valuable competitive advantage. And though everybody might be subject to different pressures, properly done, properly managed can be a way to be ahead of your competition. So which are the key components? As I said before, it's very wide, and though certain things might not look so directly related, they are. So first is the warehousing, the transportation, where you buy, the purchasing activity, the procurement, but also the distribution, the finance to understand the numbers, the IT implication, logistics implications, manufacturing, operations. So covers a whole wide array of activities are critical to any business, no matter what's the industry, no matter what the type of activity. So we have on one side what I would call the product flow. The raw materials are sent to the supplier goes to a manufacturing operation, then the distribution gets to a customer, and then a consumer. So depending on the business, you might be just a little piece of this puzzle, or you might cover the whole thing, depending if you buy raw material, you buy finished product, if you do business to business, business to consumer. But this is the wide view, and depending on the case, you can just have the whole thing or just a piece. And equally important is the information flow, and I'm going to be emphasizing this a lot. The key to properly manage the supply chain is to have the proper information. So as the product keeps moving from supplier to your company to distribution to customers, you need to have information about how the product is moving along, and then information coming back about sharing is where the product is, how has it arrived, are there restrictions, are there roadblocks? So an active flow of information following the product is key to know how to properly manage the supply chain. So which are the goals? First, probably and foremost, is maximize the level of service. You want to make sure that your product is available to your customers, that's up to their expectations, that they don't face shortages or other circumstances that might incline them to look for other products, competitive products. So how do we get there? There are several elements that we should look at the same time. We want to minimize transportation costs. What's the modality? Air, by truck, by vessel, frequency, and volume. And we'll see that depending which of these characteristics you look at, the transportation cost can go up or can come down. And the third component is minimize inventory carrying costs. The more inventory you have, you need a bigger warehouse, you run the risk of obsolescence, you need to buy insurance, you need working capital to finance it. So these are the three goals that we want to achieve. Level of service at the minimum cost with the minimum inventory. But the objective and the challenge is to optimize each one individually while finding the best balance among them to best support the company's performance. And as I'm going to show later, if you ignore one or two of these, it's easy to achieve the other one. But if the challenge here is to focus on all three and balance all three to make sure you achieve your goals in a balanced fashion. So let's start with transportation. So what are the factors you look at? Where are your suppliers? Where's the factory? You do sea, air, or land. Shipment size. You do full or partial container. How frequently you ship. Are there any stops along the way or transshipments? Are you using regular shipment or urgent shipment that costs more? And also, as we saw lately, depending on the supply demand on the containers, on the vessels, on the trucks, the price can go up and down. The element I want to bring your attention to is that you have control of many of these variables. You need to choose the modality, the size, the number of stops, the urgency, in order to control your transportation. So you want to optimize your transportation cost, but you need to keep in mind the other two factors that we're going to look at now. The other one is inventory cost. The other element you want to minimize. So how much inventory you have, how much, what I call days of supplies. And as you know, the more inventory you have, the easier it is to satisfy your demand, but the more costly it is. How many warehouses you have, where they located, how big they are, the operating cost of your warehouse. You own or you rent, you contract a third party, how many hours a day and how many days a week you operate it, how much you pay your labor, how automated it is. And it depends whether you're dealing with raw material, work in process, or finished goods. And the other factor is obsolescence. If you have products that become obsolete, about the expiration date, then you need to be very watchful of how many days they remain in the warehouse. And then there's a finance administration component in terms of you need working capital because you need to pay your suppliers, you need to cover your insurance, and you need to do the proper planning and control of where the goods are arriving, when they are leaving. So again, you can control the inventory cost by looking at these different considerations. And now, level of service. Level of service means how good are you at satisfying your customer expectations. Again, depends on you have dealing with raw material, with finished goods, with supplies, or with spare parts. Lead time, this is a key component in your consideration. Lead time is the time it takes the product to get from your vendor, whoever, at whatever level in the chain it is, to you. Potential transportation delays, as we saw very often due to weather, strikes, supply-demand issues. The opportunity cost of stockouts. How much does it cost you if when the product wants to buy your product is not available? And the impact on customers of lack of supply spare parts. Depending how critical is your spare part, a small component can shut down a very large operation. And we saw that very evidently during the COVID pandemic days, where the lack of, for instance, you said chips, stopped the production of automobiles and other things. So some small components that might not be valuable in terms of the product that finally sold to the public can have a tremendous impact. And ultimately, customer expectation. Do they expect to have all the varieties of products available every time they go to a shop? Are they willing to wait or not? So ultimately, you want to make sure that we satisfy this level of service, because if not, it's very costly. Once you lose a customer, recovering or getting a new one is very difficult. So this is the basic consideration I want to really drill on. The balance among conflicting goals. And the issue is that you should understand is depending how each one goes up or down, the other changes. So if I don't care about transportation costs, I can bring goods every day. So in that way, my level of service is good, my inventory is down, but my transportation cost goes extremely high. If I don't care about inventory costs, I have a year of inventory there, so my transportation cost is low because I do very few shipments, and my level of service is good because I always have inventory, but my inventory cost goes through the roof. If all I care is level of service, I can have a very high inventory and replenish it constantly. So my level of service would be great, but my transportation and inventory cost would be very high. So depending what your priority is, you can play with different variables to minimize your transportation costs, minimize your inventory costs, improve your level of service, keeping in mind that whenever you touch one lever, the other two levels move at the same time. You can seldom treat them independently. They all come together, and that's the way you should approach the key element of this supply chain, because these are the three things you want to achieve: the maximum level of service with the minimum transportation cost and the minimum inventory cost. So how does the interplay operate? If you assume a given level of service, if you have lower or slower transportation, you need higher inventory. So let's assume I say, I want this minimal level of service, therefore I need to have this level of inventory available. You can do it two different ways: keep a high inventory and replenish very infrequently, or have a low inventory and replenish constantly. So depending how those two play, your transportation cost plays against your inventory cost. If you're saying, okay, I want to set this budget for transportation cost, then you play with the other two. You have a lower inventory level, my level of service goes down. You have a higher inventory level, my level of service goes up. So this is the other balance: inventory cost versus level of service. If you set a given inventory level, then you play with the other two variables. A higher level of service requires faster inventory replenishment. So you see, if you look at one, the other two compete with each other. If you look at the three of them, you need to go through these questions regularly and try to balance them out. And the circumstances change. The transportation cost goes up and down depending on many circumstances. The customer expectation of level of service also might change. And the inventory carrying cost will also change because the real estate costs or labor costs or other considerations. So this interplay among these conflicting goals is probably one of the key considerations you need to be aware of in understanding that you can influence them and in the process optimize your supply chain. So which are some key tools to strike the right balance? First, you need a supply-demand process. Not many small businesses have it, but supply-demand process is primarily anticipate your demand and structure your supply to meet those requirements. That implies estimating or forecasting your demand, understanding your lead time, understand when you need to place the order with the suppliers, and understand all the dynamics of that process. So it's not that you get surprised because, oh, my demand is not what I expected. Always going to be blips and factors that you didn't expect, but you need a basic line of your expectations on which you base your purchasing activities. The other thing is integration among the supply chain components. You need to make sure that your supplier, the transportation, the distribution work in sync. Doesn't help too much to order from the supplier a lot if there's not enough vessel to bring it to where you are, or if you have the product in a warehouse and there are no trucks to take it to the place where the end user buys it. Cooperation among functional areas. This happens more in large corporations where there tend to be operations in silos. And if there's no cooperation to support the information flow, it's very, very difficult to manage this properly. So this concept of information flow, how much information you get, how good is the information, how fast you get it. And this implies, okay, how fast is my product selling? Do I have more customers? Do the customer expect to sell more? Am I really good at getting good information about it? How fast do I get it? If I get information 3 weeks later, maybe it's not useful. So creating the infrastructure to get this information flowing is extremely important, because otherwise you don't have the tools to operate your supply chain appropriately. Your ability and speed to respond to changes in supply, transportation, warehouse situation. As we said before, the circumstances change frequently, and you need to be able to adapt to that. If for whatever reason, the air transportation becomes extremely expensive, you might consider other kinds of transport, and vice versa. Maybe there are no trucks. So what can I resort to do that? Maybe I cannot find proper warehousing, or maybe I want to rent a third-party warehouse, or I want to contract a third-party logistics provider. So your ability and speed to respond to changes in demand are key. As I said before, you need a baseline to project your demand, but that's going to change. And your flexibility and speed to respond to those changes is crucial to keep your customers happy and keep your costs under control. Now, there's what I call the supply-demand process dependencies. And I want to emphasize, I didn't mention at the beginning, if you have any questions, just put in the Q&A box, and we'll look at them as soon as we finish the presentation. So please feel free to express any comments, questions, concerns, the Q&A. So which are the key dependencies? So though the basic structure of the process is similar, depending on the type of product you have. It's a product with a limited shelf life. Is the unit cost very large? Is something that you can, is it a raw material? Is a spare part that's critical to the end user? That implies the process. Stage in the product life cycle. If you're launching a product, there's a lot of uncertainty about the demand that you need to reflect in your flexibility. If you're in a growth stage, you need to be able to have enough product to fuel the demand. If the product is in its maturity, then you need to act accordingly. Need to be aware of the demand variability and have information to learn about it as soon as and as reliable as possible. Demand varies constantly, but the key thing is to have early information to react. So information availability is very important. And then, again, depends on your ability and your resources, do data analytics, both technological and human, dig it into the data about your customers, how frequently do they buy, are they the repeated customers, how sensitive they are to price. All that information you can get, but if you get the proper database, by do the proper data mining, you can learn a lot about your customers and your demand and become smarter in dealing with demand variability. And this flexibility, I come back over and over to this, to respond to changing supply or demand. You need to be always on your toes because these things are never constant, they're never as expected. So you need a basic structure to be ready, and then have the information to know what's happening. I have the flexibility and speed to react as soon as possible. What are the key challenges? And we saw a lot of this as we were going through the pandemic and still out there. First, lack of adequate supply. Production capacity, labor, COVID. You have situations like in China, they might have a zero COVID policy and they shut down factories. Maybe the capacity is impaired because there's not enough labor. Maybe there's not enough labor in one area of the world, but there's enough in another. So that's a key challenge we need to look at constantly. Shipping capacity. We saw also that all at the time were no pallets available. The pallets were in the wrong place. There were no ships available, so the rates went through the roof. The planes, labor, or is there enough labor, qualified labor? So that keeps shifting, and sometimes it's beyond your control. So what you need to do is react to it. You cannot change it. You cannot change the China policy, and you cannot make more vessels available. But what you can do is have contingency plans to react to those circumstances. Shipping costs, again, goes up and down with the demand. Shipping a container from the Far East used to cost $3,000 or $4,000, went up to $25,000 during the pandemic. Now it's getting to a more reasonable level. Tariff, you cannot control that. I mean, the US not too long ago puts a lot of tariffs on Chinese imports. So one day there are no tariffs, the next day there are tariffs, and that will impact your cost. So you have options. Shipping delays. What happens if instead of taking 2 weeks as expected, it takes 3 weeks? You have alternative, you have contingency plans. Can you afford the delay? You have enough safety stock to deal with that. And loading speed, as you probably remember, there are times where the ports were totally packed. There were not enough trucks, not enough truck drivers. The truck drivers had to wait days at the port. There was not enough equipment in the ports to bring the containers down from the ships. There were not enough labor. That has been changing, and now probably the situation is reversing. And in some ports, they're starting to be against spare capacity. So these things change over time. You cannot influence them, but you can track them. Tracking availability, as I said before, at some point in time, there were not enough trucks, so a lot of new tracking possibilities came into the market. Third parties that were very eager to get transportation, and they would probably work additional hours. Now that is shifting, but that's a factor to consider beyond your control, but affects your business. Warehousing availability. There are areas of the country where it's almost impossible to find that warehousing space at a reasonable cost. If there are places where if you're competing with companies like Amazon, the labor cost of warehousing help is extremely high. And then demand levels. There are spikes, there are dips, there are expectations. People have more money, have less money, have expectations of a recession. The rates at which people get paid go up or go down. And depending on your product, how critical it is, what's your competitive positioning, this will be another key challenge that you keep an eye on. And these considerations are very important as you design your supply chain. So what kind of things can you do to respond or be ready for these challenges? I repeat, forecast demand. Some businesses are not really paying enough attention to this. You need to understand your customers, understand your point of sales, and project your demand, knowing that it will fluctuate, but you need a baseline on which to plan. Order early. If you can anticipate your demand, you can order early enough to avoid having to pay surcharges for sending by air or surcharges for using some urgent means of transportation. Diversify your suppliers base. And this is a trade-off again, because if you have more suppliers, you have less volume and the cost might go up. But again, you need a certain security that you will be able to get the product. So sometimes it relates to how many active suppliers you have, sometimes relate to having contingency plans with alternative suppliers if your base one is not available. Shipping flexibility. Can your product be transported by ship, by train or truck, a combination of them? Is there any way you can shift from one to the other depending on cost and availability? Seek domestic vendors. You saw a lot of this lately. There's a trade-off here. Though the unit cost, if you source, for example, from the Far East, might be lower than you buy in the US, there are all these considerations of political considerations you cannot control, shipping costs, potential tariff, potential delays, difficulty in talking with your supplier. So sometimes the incremental unit cost of having a domestic vendor next to where you are is more than offset by other considerations related to inventory cost, to transportation cost, to the reliability of supply. So keep that in mind. It's not automatic that the product unit cost is the only consideration in choosing a vendor. When there are issues like that, you might try to keep a higher inventory level, but selectively. Inventory is something you don't want to have unless you need it, but it's something you want to have if there's a risk of having a stock out. You probably heard that until recently, this just-in-time concept was used by manufacturing operations, where they keep the minimum inventory needed to keep, let's say, an assembly line going. The issue is if there's a disruption, all of a sudden, the whole assembly line stops. So if you can selectively choose which are your key components that are irreplaceable, having a higher inventory level in special situations is not bad. The big problem with inventory is the speed at which rotates. If you have products that move, if they move, might take a little bit longer to move, but the big problem is that very slow movers or non-movers. Those are the ones you want to avoid. So if you have products that move and you have a certain uncertainty about the reliability of the supply, you might consider having a high inventory level of those. Can you offer alternative products? For whatever reason, not all your products are available at a given time. It is something similar you can offer to your customers. When there's not enough product, and we saw some of these also people dealt with very creatively during the pandemic, can you enhance product offerings with related services, delivery, installation, repairs, customization? This is not uniquely a supply-demand consideration, but becomes more important when you have less product to offer. If you can embellish that product with services that help your revenue, it's a way to offset this lack of available products that we suffered during a year or two. And the other thing is watch your margins. As painful as it is for everybody to see price increases, if you see your costs going up, either the product cost, transportation cost, commissions, you need to increase your prices to watch your margins. As of course, it's a trade-off here. You don't want to get to the point where you scare your customers and they walk away. We're seeing now there's a tremendous ability of corporations to increase prices because yet people seem to have the financial capability to keep buying. That is not going to last too long. So this is a trade-off here. If your margins get reduced significantly, your business might not be viable anymore. If you try to take advantage and increase your margins beyond reason, you might lose your customers. So in summary, let's go through some of the key takeaways that I hope you got from this presentation. You have to understand your supply chain. There's a product flow and an information flow, and you need to track both. You need to optimize its key variables, individually as well as the balance among them. You want to minimize your transportation costs, minimize your inventory carrying costs, maximize your level of service to the extent there's a balanced approach to them that doesn't impact your business negatively. And learn the tools available to do so. Hopefully, through the presentation, you saw some of the many tools you have. Even if you cannot control the outcome, you can influence its impact on your company. Be creative, be flexible, and open to change. Circumstances change on the supply side, on the demand side, on the warehousing side, on the transportation side. So be creative, be watchful, be willing to change, and be flexible, that accept that things don't necessarily have to be done always the same way. and be aware of the array of prevention protection actions available to face the key supply chain challenges. As with the so before, there are many things you can do, things that are under your control to protect your company, even if you cannot influence some of the key macroeconomic variables that are impacting it. So that's a summary of my presentation. We'll see if you have any questions. I try to open my, I don't see any open questions. So back now, and now I'm gonna put here a poll that would appreciate if you can all fill out. There's a couple of polls here that are very helpful for us to understand who our audience is and how we can better helpful. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to complete that. Okay, so let me now, in a second, get rid of this. So, yes. So, let me see if I can remove this thing from here. In the share.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and thank you, Ricardo, for your presentation. We will also be sending out the slides to everyone that's participated today. So just make sure to double check your email in the coming days. Thank you all so much.